The wind howled through the testing facility of Vanguard Aerospace, carrying the scent of jet fuel and ambition. Mason Reed knelt on the concrete floor, scrubbing a fuel stain with steady hands. His body ached from the old spinal injury, but his movements remained precise. The discipline of a former fighter pilot never truly fades. Above him, a procession of executives glided across the steel catwalk. Among them, Victoria Pierce, the 32-year-old CEO, her heels clicking like gunshots against metal. She paused, peering down with cold appraisal in her eyes. "Careful there," she called out, her voice slicing through the ambient noise. "Don't let your hands touch something you are not qualified to understand. Jets are meant for people who only know how to mop floors." Laughter erupted around her. Mason remained still, his gaze lifting toward the sleek fighter jet behind glass, the place where he once belonged. 6 months earlier, Victoria had inherited Vanguard after her father's sudden death. Brilliant and ruthless, she ruled with an iron grip, desperate to prove herself in an industry dominated by men twice her age. The board watched her every move, waiting for her to stumble. So she built walls around herself so high that even her reflection felt like a stranger. Mason had fallen long ago. Once an elite F-16 pilot with the Valor Squadron, he'd flown missions so classified that even the men who authorized them sometimes forgot they existed. His career ended during a rescue mission. His wingman's engine failed at 20,000 feet during a sandstorm. Mason broke formation, guided him through, but took shrapnel from ground fire. The ejection over desert terrain shattered vertebrae in his back. The metal they pinned to his chest couldn't replace the sky he'd lost. Worse still, his husband David Collins, a military doctor with gentle hands and fierce intelligence, wasn't there when Mason returned from physical therapy. Cancer had claimed him, leaving Mason to navigate grief and recovery alone. All that remained was Jason, their 8-year-old adopted son, and memories stored in an antique pocket watch that never left Mason's possession. Now he cleaned floors at Vanguard, the only job that didn't require standing for 12 hours. It was humiliating at first, working in a place where people like him had once walked as legends. But Jason could come with him after school, sit in the corner and draw airplanes with startling precision. And somehow, that made the weight of his uniform bearable. This wasn't the life Mason had imagined when he'd made history as one of the first openly gay elite fighter pilots after "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" was repealed. But it was a life that kept the lights on and food on the table. If that meant enduring Victoria Pierce's contempt, he would bear it silently, not for himself, but for the boy who carried his last name and David's smile. What Mason didn't know was that beneath Victoria's perfect exterior lay a wound that mirrored his own, and that their collision course had been set long before either of them realized it. Sometimes the people who break us are the same ones who help us rebuild, if we're brave enough to look beyond the surface. Want to know what happens next in this story of redemption, courage, and finding your wings again? Follow Heart Stories for more emotional journeys that remind us that sometimes falling isn't the end. It's just the beginning of learning to fly forward differently. Victoria Pierce stood alone in her corner office, staring at the photograph of her father. Richard Pierce had commanded rooms, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and shaken hands with generals and senators. He taught her that respect was earned through dominance, that sympathy was weakness dressed in pretty words. When he collapsed, clutching his chest, she was in Tokyo closing a deal. The funeral was private, the press conference flawless. Every night since, she practiced his expression in the mirror, the one that said nothing could break her, but something already had. The board meeting earlier that day had been brutal. They questioned her decision to cut the safety training budget, suggested perhaps a woman couldn't understand the technical aspects of aerospace engineering. Victoria had responded by firing 2 mid-level managers on the spot. Fear was a language everyone understood. Meanwhile, in the maintenance wing, Mason wiped sweat from his brow as he finished mopping the training room floor. He glanced at his watch, David's watch, the engraving inside a permanent reminder. "To the man who taught me to fly without leaving the ground." Jason sat cross-legged in the corner, sketch pad balanced on his knees, drawing what looked like an engine schematic with surprising accuracy. "That's actually pretty close," said a young engineer named Marcus, crouching beside Jason. "You've got natural talent." Mason watched from a distance as Marcus spent 20 minutes explaining thrust-to-weight ratios while Jason absorbed every word, his eyes bright with recognition. Something cracked open in Mason's chest. This was why he stayed. Not for himself, but for his son. The adoption hadn't come easy. After David died, the system seemed determined to separate them. "A single gay man with a spinal injury isn't an ideal candidate," the social worker had said, avoiding eye contact. Mason had fought for 2 years, with help from Lambda Legal and every connection from his military days. "This boy deserves stability," he'd argued during the final hearing, voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've flown through war zones and survived. I know how to navigate storms." In the end, what convinced the judge was Jason himself, clutching Mason's hand and refusing to let go. "He already has a dad," the boy had whispered, "even if Papa David can't be here anymore." That evening, as Mason guided Jason through the facility toward the exit, they passed Victoria conducting a tour for investors. Her voice carried like steel, recounting profit margins and market projections. Her gaze caught on Jason's sketches, then narrowed at the sight of Mason in his uniform. "This is a place for innovation," she told the investors, voice just loud enough to reach Mason's ears. "Not everyone here is qualified to contribute, of course, but we maintain appearances." That night, Mason sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his arm in the dim light. The tattoo was still there, hidden beneath his long sleeves, a pair of iron wings with wings of valor inscribed below. He hadn't looked at it in months. It reminded him of everything he'd lost: the sky, David, the version of himself that believed he mattered. What Mason didn't know was that Victoria's harshness masked a desperate insecurity. Her father had never prepared her for leadership, merely expected perfection. Now she ruled through intimidation because she couldn't imagine another way. What neither realized was how their paths had already crossed in classified mission files, and how a small boy's accident would soon bring those histories crashing into the present. In this world where both had learned to hide their vulnerabilities, the greatest courage would come not from flying higher, but from daring to fall without fear. Because sometimes the things that break us are the very same things that teach us what we're truly made of. The prototype testing chamber gleamed under industrial lights, a cathedral of steel and precision. Warning signs lined the entrance: restricted area, authorized personnel only. Despite Mason's warnings, Jason had wandered in while his father cleaned an adjacent hallway. The boy stood transfixed, watching engineers adjust panels on an experimental jet wing suspended 30 feet above the floor. "I was just looking," Jason whispered when Victoria's voice cut through the machinery hum. Her heels announced her arrival like a judge's gavel. "This is a place for people who know how to fly, not people who dream," Victoria snapped, gesturing to the prototype. "Do you know how much that costs? More than your house? More than your school? More than anything you will ever touch in your life?" Mason arrived running, uniform damp with sweat, his breath short from panic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, he won't." "What, wander into $1 million facility again?" Victoria's gaze swept over him, cold and dismissive. "You think mopping floors in a hangar will get you back into the sky?" The room fell silent. Other workers pretended not to listen. Someone chuckled. Another coughed to hide a laugh. Mason's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Not here. Not in front of Jason. He took his son's hand and led him toward the exit. What happened next occurred in heartbeats. An alarm blared. The overhead crane system jolted. Jason, startled, stepped backward onto the platform railing. The boy teetered, then fell, not to the floor, but onto a suspended maintenance scaffold 30 feet up. The structure tilted precariously, threatening to dump him into the testing chamber below, where automated systems began their emergency shutdown sequence. "Systems lockdown in 60 seconds, announced the computerized voice. Once sealed, The chamber would be inaccessible for hours. Without hesitation, Mason sprinted toward the access ladder. His back screamed in protest as he climbed, faster than he had moved in years. Victoria watched in horror as he navigated the narrow catwalk, his movements precise despite the pain evident on his face. This wasn't a janitor's shuffle. This was the calculated grace of someone trained for emergency response. Mason reached Jason just as the scaffold gave way. Securing his son with one arm, he used his free hand to swing them onto a maintenance platform seconds before the scaffold crashed below. The observation room erupted in shocked applause as Mason guided his terrified son down to safety. In the medical bay, Jason needed a blood transfusion for a deep cut on his arm. When Mason rolled up his sleeve to donate, Victoria gasped. There, vivid against his skin, was the Wings of Valor insignia, the same emblem in the classified file from her father's rescue. 8 years ago, Richard Pierce had been kidnapped during a diplomatic mission to the Middle East. A special forces unit with air support extracted him under heavy fire. The mission leader, a pilot with the call sign Phoenix, had sustained critical injuries during extraction. "It was you," Victoria whispered, recognition dawning. "You saved my father." Mason's eyes met hers, no longer subservient. "I was just doing my job, Miss Pierce. But you never came forward for recognition when my father offered it." Mason looked at his sleeping son. "Some things matter more than medals. Your father understood that. Eventually, the truth settled between them. Mason Reed wasn't just a janitor with a past. He was the man her father had called the bravest soul I ever met, and Victoria had spent months treating him like he was nothing." As hospital monitors beeped softly in the background, Victoria faced a reckoning more painful than any board meeting, recognizing how easily we dismiss those whose worth isn't immediately visible, and how quickly we judge stories we haven't bothered to read. Sometimes the people we look down upon are the very ones who once soared higher than we could imagine, and might teach us to soar again, if only we'd listen. The boardroom of Vanguard Aerospace buzzed with tension. Victoria Pierce stood at the head of the table, her usual armor of confidence visibly cracked. "I've called this meeting to discuss a significant change in company direction," she announced, her voice steadier than her hands. Around the table, board members exchanged glances. They had never seen her uncertain before. "6 months ago, I took over this company determined to prove I was strong enough. I fired people who didn't meet my standards. I dismissed voices that didn't echo my own. And I insulted a man who turned out to be the person who saved my father's life." Confusion spread across the faces of the board. Victoria continued, revealing Mason's identity and his connection to Richard Pierce's rescue years ago. She explained the accident with Jason and how it had exposed not just Mason's past, but the flaws in her leadership. "Strength isn't about never falling," she said, echoing words Mason had shared during their conversation at the hospital. "It's about who you lift up when you do." Not everyone supported her vision. Bradley Thompson, the most senior board member, leaned forward with barely concealed contempt. "You want to appoint a janitor, a gay janitor with a questionable family situation as safety advisor. This isn't about inclusion. Victoria, it's about business." Victoria didn't flinch. "My father trusted this man with his life. I'm trusting him with our company's watcher. And if anyone here has a problem with Mason's family, they can submit their resignation along with this afternoon's press release." The following day, cameras flashed as Victoria stood at the podium in the main conference room. Mason waited at the back, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. Victoria announced the new position, praising Mason's service and acknowledging her misjudgment. The reporters leaned forward, their cameras clicking rapidly. "Effective today, I'm appointing Mason Reed as Honorary Safety Advisor for Vanguard Aerospace. He'll oversee flight safety training and mentor our engineers in the values of the Valor Squadron: integrity, courage, and service above self." Applause erupted, but when reporters rushed to interview Mason, he stepped back. "I don't need a title, Miss Pierce," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. "Then what do you need?" Victoria asked. genuinely surprised. A classroom, a space where kids like my son, kids who can't afford flight school, kids whose parents work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, can learn about aviation. That's the real legacy, not medals, not press conferences, teaching the next generation to fly. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since taking over the company, it reached her eyes. Then we'll build it, together. She raised her hand to quiet the reporters. One more thing, this foundation won't just bear the Valor name. It'll be funded by a portion of Vanguard's profits every year. Because if we're going to build planes that touch the sky, we need to build people who remember why the sky matters. Within weeks, construction began on a new wing of the Vanguard facility, a learning center with flight simulators, workshop spaces, and a scholarship fund for underprivileged children. They called it the Valor Foundation, with special emphasis on including LGBTQ+ youth who, like Mason, might otherwise never see themselves represented in aerospace. As the walls took shape, Mason found an unexpected ally in Victoria. Her transformation wasn't instantaneous. She still ran meetings with precision and demanded excellence, but she learned to listen before deciding, to value perspective over performance metrics. One evening, as they reviewed plans for the foundation's opening, Mason showed Victoria the pocket watch David had given him before his final deployment. He said time is the only thing we can't engineer more of, Mason explained, his voice soft with memory. So we should build things that matter while we can. Victoria nodded, understanding finally what her father had tried to tell her before he died. True leadership isn't measured in the power you wield, but in the lives you change. In allowing Mason to rebuild his wings, she had unexpectedly found her own, not made of iron and ambition, but of compassion and purpose that would carry her company higher than profits ever could. 1 year later, the Valor Foundation opened its doors on a bright Saturday morning. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was smaller than corporate demonstrations had been, more intimate, somehow more important. Jason stood at the front holding oversized scissors that were almost as big as he was, his wrist fully healed, a proud smile lighting his face. Mason stood beside him, his hand on his son's shoulder, wearing a button-down shirt instead of his janitor's uniform. Victoria stood on the other side, no longer the untouchable CEO, but someone who'd learned to lead with her heart instead of her armor. Behind them, a new jet prototype gleamed on the tarmac, painted with the Iron Wings insignia and the words Wings of Valor along its fuselage. The press called it the Plane of Faith, a symbol of Vanguard's rebirth under Victoria's transformed leadership. The company's stock had climbed steadily over the past year, but more importantly, morale had soared. People wanted to work there now, not out of fear, but out of pride. 50 children from underserved communities filled the hangar, their eyes wide as Marcus and the other engineers explained thrust, lift, drag, and dreams. They were kids from neighborhoods where college seemed impossible, where the sky was just something above the buildings, not a place you could actually go. One little boy, no more than 9, raised his hand. Can anyone learn to fly? Mason crouched down to meet his eyes, the same way he did with Jason every night. Anyone who's willing to fall first. The boy grinned, his front teeth missing, his future suddenly bigger than it had been 5 minutes ago. As the sun set, casting orange and gold light across the runway, Mason walked out to the new jet. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the cool metal under his fingers, the rivets and seams and promise of flight. Victoria joined him, her heels replaced with sneakers, her blazer gone, just a simple blouse and jeans. Do you ever miss it, flying? She asked. He nodded. Every day, but I found something better. What's that? A reason to stay grounded, she smiled, understanding now what her father had learned from Mason years ago. My father used to say that the best pilots aren't the ones who fly the highest. They're the ones who bring everyone home. They stood in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Inside the hangar, children laughed and dreamed, and for the first time in a long time, neither Mason nor Victoria felt alone. They'd both fallen. They'd both learned to fly again, just in a different way. Mason walked to the edge of the runway, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the tattoo fully. He took the pocket watch from his pocket, opened it one last time, then carefully placed it inside a special display case in the Foundation's entrance hall. Beside it, he placed his wedding ring, not abandoning the memory, but honoring it by creating space for new beginnings. What about you? Have you ever found that your greatest loss led to an unexpected new path? Sometimes the wings we're given aren't the ones we expected, but they can still carry us to places we never imagined possible. Share your story of resilience in the comments below. And remember to follow Heart Stories for more journeys that remind us all that true courage isn't about never falling. It's about how we rise again.